I have refilled my water and I am now ready to talk about species. Okay. So, first, I've been talking about species now, like, you know what that is. One of the coolest classes that I took in graduate school was actually an entire quarter, shorter than a semester, but still, an entire quarter, where the only thing we talked about that entire quarter was talked about speciation, all the different kind of ins and outs of what a species is and how do you know when you have new ones and all of that kind of stuff. It was such a cool class, one of my faves. Anyway, and that's when I learned even more than I had known before that about this guy. So this gentleman here is named Ernst Mayr, and Ernie, as I like to call him, because am too casual with everybody's names in you know important science figures. Um, Ernie, he actually he lived a very long life. He was like 105 years old when he died, and it was in like I want to say like 2001 is when he died. So as old as this picture looks, like he lived a long time. He was when he was older, he actually came to Cal Poly Pomona, where I went to graduate school, and had a like debate with one of my professors. It was before I was there, which is a bummer because that would have been so amazing to see that, right? But anyway, so Ernst Mayr, was an ornithologist, and he studied ornithologists study birds in Papua New Guinea was one of the places that he studied. So tropical island, the middle of the Pacific, and one of the things that he found really fascinating while he was studying his birds is he thought it was really, really interesting how even though he and the native folks, people who lived there, even though they spoke different languages and they came from very different cultures and, were as different as any, two types of people can be, he found it really interesting that, when he said, oh, there's 47 different species of birds on this island, the native folks also said that. And so it got him kind of thinking like philosophically, it's like, okay, so I call these different type species and they have a different name for that because their language is completely different. But it's interesting that we both agree that there are 47 different things within this bird category. And isn't that kind of interesting? And so that got him thinking, and it emboldened him to develop what is now called the biological species concept, which is a little bit, he's a little proud of himself, right? That's not a very humble thing to say, like, well, this idea that I invented, I'm going to call it the biological species concept instead of like, Ernie's definition for what a species is, right? He was just basically saying like all other biologists, must be on board with my definition because of course they are. Anyway, so he was not a humble person. Okay, so we will talk about what his species concept is in just a moment, okay? But first I want to talk a little bit about what does it mean to be different species? So do similar looking organisms belong to the same species? How do we know? How do we know if they are or they're not in the same species, right? So this is, from a different edition of a different, completely different textbook. And so I love this old picture of Bill Gates and Oprah there, right? Are they in the same species? Right? So, they look pretty different. They have different hair color, different skin color. Their facial structure is a little different. Right? How about those two middle pictures? The roses. Roses. One of them's a rose. That kind of gave it away. Sorry. Right? The flowers. That's what I was trying to say. So the pink flowers. Are those in the same species? How about on the right? Right? Those little rodents over there. Are they the same species? Are they not? How do you know? Okay. So being able to determine what a species is can be very challenging, because sometimes organisms that are distinct species, that really are separate species, look an awful lot alike. And other times, individuals that are within the same species have so much diversity that they look incredibly different. So one of my favorite examples of that are dogs, right? Dogs are all the same species, whether you're talking about a pug, or, or a Great Dane, right? Or a sheepdog, right? All dogs are the same species, even though they are incredibly diverse, okay? That's true of humans, right? So here's a bunch of beautiful people, right? And we're incredibly diverse species, but we're all in the same species, okay? And what's interesting is then you look at these two birds. These are two different birds called meadowlarks. And so one of them is an eastern meadowlark. The other one is a western meadowlark. I don't even know which one's which because I can't tell by looking at them. Okay. And they are distinct species. They're distinct species, right? But how do you know that? How do we know that these guys are two separate species, but all of these guys are the same species? Like, what? So let's go back to this for a second. So which of these pairs are the same species? Bill and Oprah, same species. Lily and Rose, not the same species. That looks like some sort of little pocket mouse, and a rat, not the same species, right? So even though the two rodents look, I don't know, probably almost as similar to each other as Bill and Oprah look, right? But not the same species. So how do we know this? Okay. And so, right, so these big questions are why Ernie developed the biological species concept. Okay. So the biological species concept, essentially what it says is that you know that two organisms are in the same species if they are able to interbreed with each other, so have babies together, or they could possibly, under normal conditions, and they are reproductively isolated from other such groups. What does that mean in English? If you look at two individuals and they can make babies together, theoretically, right? So under normal natural circumstances, they can make babies together. Then you would consider them to be the same species. Okay? So that's the definition of a species. All right. So assuming that nobody's infertile, right? Theoretically, any of these humans could make babies with one of the other humans of the opposite sex, right? Bill Gates and Oprah, theoretically, could have a baby. But you can't, a rose and a lily can't have babies together. They just can't. A pocket mouse and a rat can't have babies together. They just can't. Okay? So that's the kind of practical definition, right? So this is like the formal definition of what a species is, right? And so like I said, this is, right? This is the invention, this concept, biological species concept, right? Or the BSC is the brainchild of Ernst Mayr. Okay? All right. So what's this bit about being reproductively isolated, right? Like I said, that basically just means you can't have babies together. So for whatever reason, you can't effectively reproduce. Okay. So why are these two birds different species? I mean, they look the same. They're the same size. They're both birds. Why on earth would they be two different species? So let's talk about reproductive isolation. Okay. This is an image from another book. I find it tragically amusing and also disturbing. Okay. So I find the picture on the left-hand side, the prezygotic barriers. So let's talk about what a zygote is, first of all. So a zygote is a fertilized egg. So even before you were an embryo, you were a zygote. Okay, so a zygote is a fertilized egg. So pre-zygotic means before the formation of a zygote. So before fertilization, before the egg is fertilized by the sperm. Okay, and so there's all kinds of examples of different pre-zygotic reproductive barriers, which we'll talk about. We'll talk about some examples of all of them because it's really kind of interesting. What I find offensive about this picture is that not only is it implying that this pig and this German Shepherd could, you know, potentially mate, but the thing that I find extra offensive is that pig is clearly a baby. That's a piglet. Come on. That German Shepherd would never hurt that little baby piglet. Anyway, it's pigophilia. That was bad. Don't tell the dean that I said that. Okay. Anyway, so we will talk about what we will give examples of prezygotic barriers in a second. So just remember, prezygotic means that there's some sort of reason why the egg never gets fertilized. So the barrier occurs before an egg could get fertilized. There are also post-zygotic barriers. What does that mean? So that means that fertilization occurs, mating occurs, and fertilization occurs. But then there's something after that that keeps the species separate. And that's a picture of a mule right there. So we'll talk more about that in a minute. Okay. So if we were doing, you know, the hardcore explanation of all of the reproductive barriers, right? All of this reproductive isolation. Okay. We would be talking about all these in order and, you know, details and all of that. We're not going to get into, we're basically going to kind of clump these all together into one thing. And we're going to talk about some different examples of these just because they're entertaining, right? But really the most important thing, right? So in fact, I do want you to know the different prezygotic ones, but, you know, mostly it's like, is that prezygotic or is it a post-zygotic barrier? That's kind of the most important point. Okay, so this essentially shows you like a little timeline of an egg and a sperm, and these are all the places they can be prevented from forming viable just means you're alive, and then fertile offspring, fertile meaning that you can then have babies of your own, right? So your chances of having grandbabies. Okay, all right, so let's talk about some. I have 8 million stories for all of these, so I'm going to try to control myself. Temporal isolation, what does that mean? Temporal isolation means tempo means time. So temporal isolation essentially means that individuals are prevented from mating because they do not mate at the same time. So this example is showing spotted skunks because different species of spotted skunks they go into heat and they breed at different times of year. So even if they live in the same area, they'll never reproduce together because their mating season is different. So that's temporal isolation. A good example of extreme temporal isolation are cicadas. So cicadas are a type of insect. For any of you that have ever lived in the eastern US, cicadas are, and we have them here, but they're a thing in the East Coast, right? They're not so much a thing here. They are very loud insects. And there are certain species that only come out every 13 or 17 years. Talk about temporal barriers, time barriers, okay? Okay. So that's one of the prezygotic barriers. Another prezygotic barrier is habitat isolation. So that just means that you live in different places. So your habitat where you live is different. So these are two different species of garter snakes. Even if they live in the same general vicinity, right? So in the same state, even in the same forest, I don't know, but they don't spend their days in the same place. One of them spends its day hanging out in water, slithering out in water, hunting in water, and the other one hunts on land. They're not going to meet each other. So they're separated by habitat. So habitat isolation. Behavioral isolation is perhaps the most entertaining. Behavioral isolation is a big deal in birds. So you should be remembering right now, Ernst Mayr, bird guy, right? Who's into birds. Okay. So these two birds in this picture are called blue-footed boobies, and they live in the Galapagos Islands, and they are adorbs. And so I included a little clip of blue-footed boobies dancing in the you know, where I have all the YouTube videos for this in that page, because it's too cute. They lift up their little flippers, and then they hold out their wings and they bow to each other, and they like dance. And they bow, and it's just super cute. Okay, so what does that have to do with behavioral isolation? So blue-footed boobies the males have to dance a specific dance, and they have to show the female their feet in order for her to be willing to mate with him. So they have to have a certain behavior in order to mate. Okay, this is really common in birds like our meadowlarks here. So meadowlarks are songbirds, and you know, they're not very big birds. The eastern meadowlark is like in the eastern half of North America. The western meadowlark is the western half of North America. They basically look the same. They even overlap in the middle of the country, right? They live in, you know, similar areas, okay? But they are very strongly behaviorally isolated from one another because the males of meadowlarks sing different songs. And so the male of the eastern meadowlark, a western meadowlark female is not going to be interested in his song. She's just going to be like, oh, I'm not going to mate with you. What the hell are you singing? Ew. Right? And vice versa. Okay. So they are very strongly behaviorally isolated. Okay. So sometimes it's a dance, like our boobies. Sometimes it's a song. Sometimes it's other weird things. What am I showing you? Okay. So, because I can't help myself, and I love this example. These are structures created by a type of bird called bowerbirds. Like I said, birds are really big with their behavioral stuff, right? Like the males have to do a thing for the females, whether it's sing a song, do a dance, do something. They have to show her that they are, you know, the bird for her. Okay. So bowerbirds are really interesting. Male bowerbirds build a structure called a bower, right? And you might be thinking, oh, so it's like a nest. They build a nest. They don't actually raise babies in the bower. The bower is only for mating. So it's like the bachelor pad. He's like, I gotta get a sweet bachelor pad. I gotta get it all like tricked out and nice looking. Yeah, to attract me a lady bowerbird. I'm gonna bring her back to my bower. Bada bing, bada boom. And then, you know, there's a nest somewhere else where she lays the eggs and, you know, they raise the fam. Okay. But they have to build these elaborate bowers to impress the females. And there's a bunch of different species of bowerbirds, and they all have different looking bowers. The one on the left is a bower that's in a more sort of natural habitat without as much human influence. So notice that he's, you know, made a like space through the middle of these plants, right? So he's kind of built these walls, and then he's decorated with, you know, bones and rocks and stuff. So he's made it pretty. Bones at shells. There's a shell. There's a bone. Yeah? Okay. Whereas clearly this bowerbird lives in an area where people live because he has found all of the most colorful trash. Right? And so they go for specific colors. He does have some natural stuff too. He has fruit, right, that he probably picked out of trees, but you know, he's got a wide variety. He really likes whatever these things are, these red cans. He thinks those are pretty. Right? So once again, it's this behavior thing. It's like, I'm going to show you that I am a suitable mate by singing a correct song, by doing a dance with my cute blue feet, or by building the coolest looking bachelor pad out of the whole neighborhood. Yeah? Okay, so that's another example of behavioral isolation. Okay, mechanical isolation essentially means if the parts don't fit together, you can't make a zygote. So these two snails, poor snails, they really want to mate, but their genital pores don't line up. So they're different species, even though they're very similar to each other. This one's genital pore is on the left side of its body. This one's genital pore is on the right side of its body. And so when they do the normal thing that snails do, snails do drive-by mating. Usually they go like, pew, they swap gametes. That's the generic name for eggs and sperm. And then they just keep going, right? So these guys are trying to line up and they can't figure out how to line up. Oh, so that's mechanical isolation. The parts don't fit together. Gametic isolation. A gamete is a generic term for eggs or sperm. So gametes. Okay. So gametic isolation means that the gametes, for whatever reason, the sperm can't fertilize the egg. So like the egg has a protective shell that the sperm can't get through or something. Okay. So that's gametic isolation. It's not as entertaining as the other ones. Okay. So those are all prezygotic barriers, right? And so the only real, we're going to kind of crunch this all together. So in other books, they separate it all out and talk about the difference between reduced hybrid viability, reduced hybrid fertility, hybrid breakdown, whatever. We're just going to kind of talk about those things all together. So post-zygotic barriers occur when two individuals of different species mate and they produce a zygote, post-zygotic, but something happens. Either that zygote, it starts to develop, but then it dies young, or it develops into a healthy adult, but that healthy adult turns out to be sterile, so they can't then have their own babies. So it still is kind of like a dead end, right? Or hybrid breakdown, which is like that happens over multiple generations. So the kind of classic example of a post-zygotic barrier is horses and donkeys. So horses and donkeys, clearly two different species, right? If you have, I want to say it's a female horse and a male donkey, and they mate, you will get what we call a mule. Look at that cute mule. He's got kind of a donkey looking face, right? And he's got kind of like donkey ears. Yeah, but he's taller. And mules are actually really cool. He's got kind of a donkey tail, right? But he's taller and he's a little like more sleek and streamlined like a horse, whereas donkeys are like shorter and scrappier, right? The benefit of mules are great animals, actually, if you are interested in horses to use. So not just because they're pretty, but like if you're interested in having an animal that can, that you can take camping, right? Where you're make it carry a whole bunch of stuff for you, right? Or if you lived on a farm and you needed a plow animal, mules are great at that because they're strong, right? And so like they have the size of a horse, but they're a little more, they're not as like, they don't freak out as easily as like horses do, right? Because donkeys are like tougher, but donkeys are small, right? So anyway, so mules kind of like this perfect combo. The problem with mules though is that they're sterile, right? So you get a mule and you think, I'm going to breed, I get two mules, I get a boy mule and a girl mule. I'm going to breed them and it's going to be great. Nope, didn't work that way because they're sterile, right? So even though a horse and a donkey can produce offspring, that offspring cannot then reproduce. They're sterile. So, so that's the end of the line. So that's post-zygotic, okay? I always forget it now, but I got really into this whole like mule thing and like understanding about mules, and I did some research, and apparently if the sex of the parents is flip-flopped, so I want to say if mom's a horse and dad's a donkey, you get a mule. If mom is the donkey and dad is the horse, you get something called a hinny. Who knew? Okay. Ligers would be an example of something like this. So sometimes you hear about these interesting, crossbreed types of animals, like a liger, which is a lion tiger, or a tion, tiger lion. The thing about these, though, is that, okay, they reproduce, but not naturally, right? So you wouldn't see any of this happening in the wild because they don't live in the same places. They live in totally different continents. So the only time you're going to get a liger and a tion is if they're in captivity, right? And then maybe a lion and a tiger will mate, but it's not in natural occurrence. Okay. Anyway. All right. So here's the big problem with our friend Ernie. Ernie had this very bold statement about what he thought a species was, the biological species concept, right? If different individuals can interbreed with each other under natural conditions and they produce, fertile offspring and they're reproductively isolated from other groups, then they're the same species. Cool. Problem is, he was perhaps a little too proud of himself, because the fact of the matter is that we can't use his definition of a species for everything. It works great for birds, which is no surprise because he was a bird guy, right? So it works great for most animals, but there are situations where we can't use the biological species concept, so we need some other species concept. So, for example, if we're talking about something that is extinct and has been extinct for, millions of years, how are we going to know if they could mate with one another or not? They all dead. We don't know, right? Or what if you have a species that reproduces asexually? So asexual, whenever you put a in front of a word, it means without. So asexual reproduction means you reproduce without sex. So essentially you just make clones of yourself. Well, how do I know if two different bacteria are the same species or not, if they would never mate with each other? Because bacteria don't do that. They just clone themselves. How would I know that, right? So there are tons of exceptions to the biological species concept. So biological species concept in general works pretty well for animals that are currently alive. It does not work well for things that have been extinct for a long time. It does not work at all for things, well, it doesn't work at all for things that have been extinct for a long time. It doesn't work at all for things that reproduce asexually. And it doesn't work particularly well for plants, because it turns out that plants sometimes are less picky about who they reproduce with. Go figure, right? And so, yeah, so even though the biological species concept is the one that you always learn in your class, right, it turns out it's really not that simple. And so at the end of my quarter, where we talked about species and speciation, at the end, like the last thing we talked about was, okay, so let's write a definition for what a species is, after talking about it for 10 weeks. And it was like this weird list of like, well, if you're this, it's this, and if you're this, it's this, and if you're, it's complicated. Okay. Anyway, it's kind of an interesting idea. All right. So, trying to figure out what I want to. Okay. So now that we've talked about species, we need to talk about speciation for a hot minute, and then we're going to be done with this video. And then the next video, which I'm going to film tomorrow morning, right? Okay, so let's talk about speciation. So a species, we already defined what a species is. Okay, so what is speciation? Speciation is the process by which you get new species. Okay, and so, here's our like parent population. All right, and so these two pictures are trying to represent two different types of species: allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. So let's break down that word, those words, I should say. Okay, so patric essentially means country. So literally it means fatherland, but okay. Sim means the same, and allo means different. Okay, so the literal translation of these two words, allopatric, literally means different country. Sympatric literally means same country. So what those terms essentially tell us is there some sort of geographic barrier or separation? And you can see in the allopatric one, there is, right? So in this case, the geographic barrier is a mountain range that develops over time, but it could just as easily be a canyon that's carved through an area, or it could be a land bridge forming and separating a shallow sea into two halves, right? So any kind of physical barrier has the potential to result in allopatric speciation. okay? Allopatric speciation, I think, is easier to understand. So we're going to look at that one first, but then we're going to look at sympatric speciation, which occurs when you get a new species, but there's no physical separation. Okay, so we'll talk about some things that can lead to that too. Right, so classic example of allopatric speciation. This is in your book. They're even using the same species. The figure looks different, and I kind of like this one because I like the colors. So so classy, right? That I make videos where you can hear me like, anyway, sorry. I also feel sorry for if any of your family members are watching this and they're like, oh my God, your biology professor is disgusting. She's so like crude. Ugh. Okay. So squirrels that live near the Grand Canyon. Okay. So there's these two different species of ground squirrels that once upon a time were likely one population, right? That have been separated, right? And so now we have these two separate species of ground squirrels that are really, 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 really similar because they haven't been separated for very long, right? They've only been separated for, relatively speaking, a short period of time. And so they no longer interbreed. They've developed enough genetic differences that they have become two separate species. Okay? Right. This is also likely the situation with the Galapagos Islands. So do I have a picture of the Galapagos on here? Yes. Okay, so we'll come back to that in a second, right? So here's the islands, yeah? So the islands are the little chain of islands is super far away from Ecuador, right? That's the closest South American country to the Galapagos Islands. So it's pretty far away from Ecuador. But even the islands themselves are far enough away from each other that for a little tiny bird like a finch, they're not going to easily fly from one island to another because it's too far of a journey for them, right? They're not distance flyers. They're not like seagulls or something. Okay. So, right. So we see a bunch of allopatric speciation where during an event like a big storm, some finches get blown to a new island. And on that new island, now they're separated from their previous population. And, there's different foods there because the islands are different from each other. There's different, other organisms there to eat. So different food, there's different competitors. There's all kinds of stuff happening that's different on the different islands. And so we see these really big differences in finch species in the Galapagos. So these are just a handful of them. So the one that is most similar to the types of finches that we have around here is a small tree finch. Small tree finch. That's probably the one that's most similar to the mainland finch from Ecuador. Some of the finches on some of the islands, they call them the woodpecker finch. They're totally not woodpeckers, but they are smart and they use a cactus spine as a spear, and they actually catch grubs that way in the trees. So they find a little hole and they poke the spear in and they pull the little grub out, and that's how they eat. Isn't that crazy? And here's one of these big, look at the beak on that dude, right? So he eats big seeds. Yeah. Vampire finches suck blood. Look at that. That's terrifying. One of my chickens pecked me on the leg the other day. Can you imagine? It reminded me of this. I was having nightmares. You get the idea. Okay. So that's all allopatric speciation. So there's physical separation. Sometimes species get separated, but ultimately they don't really speciate. So they don't become, so a population divides, but then when they come back together, they can still interbreed. So speciation has not occurred. They have not become separate species, okay? Other times they have when they separate. Now they can no longer breed with one another. So speciation has occurred, okay? All right. So let's talk about sympatric speciation. Like I said, allopatric speciation I think is easy enough to kind of wrap your brain around, right? It's this idea that, okay, well, these guys are breeding with each other. These guys are breeding with each other. There's no mixing. over time, they're going to be different from one another. And so it kind of makes sense that they would eventually, those two populations would eventually become different species. It seems much more like, okay, that's logical, right? Whereas sympatric speciation, it's like, so wait, you're telling me that you had this species and then all of a sudden this new species like popped up right in the middle of it. Like, what? So I'm going to give you two different examples of how that might happen, okay? One of them is through a process of hybridization called polyploidy. You do not need to know that name, polyploidy, okay? But let me just kind of explain this story. We have not learned about genetics yet, right? So you don't know what a chromosome is yet or any of that kind of stuff, okay? So, all right. You can have different species. Remember how I said that plants were a little less picky about who they mate with? Okay. So at some point, about 8,000 years ago, there were a couple of different grasses, right? And those two grasses, even though they were different species, could interbreed with each other. Okay. And they produced this hybrid, which was sterile. But then because of a genetic fluke, because of a mutation, that sterile hybrid was able to self-fertilize, right? And what you can see if you look at these images is that the actual structure of the plant changed. Because what ended up happening is we ended up with all of these errors in cell division, and they produced wheat plants that had way more chromosomes than they were supposed to. And ultimately, this accident of nature that occurred produced this species of wheat that many modern cultures are, you know, based on, right? So the wheat that we use to make bread and pasta and yada, 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 right, is that type of wheat. And it occurred because of a mutation, a genetic accident. The reason this is an example of sympatric speciation is this all happened in the same place, right? So all of these different grasses can live in the same place, but after the accident, the genetic accident occurred each time, they couldn't breed back and forth anymore. So this is a separate species from this, even though it came from that, right? This is a different species from this. Most of the time they don't breed with each other. Sometimes they do. Plants ruin all the stories. I love plants, but they, you know. Okay, so that's a type of sympatric speciation. Okay, and then this is the cutest example of sympatric speciation. So this particular example, this critter is an axolotl. And I have a couple in my house, in my bedroom, actually. That's where their tank is. And we have a bunch at school. And axolotls are super fun because they are a type of salamander that is really weird. Okay, so most axolotls, or not most axolotls, most salamanders are very much like frogs. They're amphibians, right? So, and you all, I know you learned this in like preschool and kindergarten because my kids both did. You learn the life cycle of a frog, right? So frogs lay eggs in the water, and then that little egg hatches, and out comes a little tadpole, and it has a little tail and little gills, and it lives in the water, and then eventually it grows little legs, and its tail disappears, and its gills go away, and it develops lungs, and then it's a frog, and now it lives on land. Now, it swims in the water a lot, but it breathes air, okay? So most amphibians, that's their lifestyle, right? That's their lifestyle. That's their life cycle, right? Their eggs are laid in water. The young have gills and live underwater for a period of time. But then when they transition into their adult form, oftentimes there's other body changes as well. But one of the things that happens is they lose their gills, okay? What's unique about axolotls is that axolotls don't lose their gills, okay? So they're a weird salamander. right? Don't lose gills. That's what those feathery things are on either side of its head in adulthood. And so what that means is that unlike every other species of salamander, the adults of axolotls live their whole life in water, kind of like a fish, even though they're not a fish. They're a salamander, right? But they can't leave the water because they have gills for their whole life, right? Okay, so let's relate this back to, so this is called, this process, by the way, it's called pedomorphosis, which literally means child shaping, right? Or child shaped. Let's say it that way. Child form. I'm gonna say child form. Right? So they become adults, they reach sexual maturity, but they still have juvenile features. And so this, in the case of our axolotls, that juvenile feature that they retain are gills. And so what's interesting about this is all that this would take is a mutation in a developmental gene. So the gene that normally controls, okay, and now's the time when we lose our gills, right? If something happens to that gene that triggers that process, then they don't lose their gills. One small mutation can totally cause them to have to spend the rest of their lives in water, right? And then if they can't get out of water, they can't mate with anybody else except other ones that are, you know, other freak shows that are stuck underwater, right? And that's how axolotls came to be, okay? Anyway, right, so that's not only an example of sympatric speciation, because you have a speciation event where a new species is formed, right, in nearby to, you know, another species, but it's also an example of pedomorphosis. Okay, here's another fun example of pedomorphosis, right? Skulls in humans. Okay, so what we're looking at in this picture is we're looking at, is this gonna wrap it up for this video? No, we got one more thing after this. Okay. Okay, so in primates, right? So within apes, right, a particular group of primates, what we're looking at is we're comparing two different primates. We're comparing a chimpanzee and a human, okay? And what we're looking at in these two pictures is we are looking at a fetal skull. So the skull of a fetus, right? So remember, fetus is before you're born, okay? And if you compare the shapes of the fetal skull in a chimpanzee and a human, their shapes are very similar, okay? And so they laid this red grid on here so that you can kind of see how the proportions of the skull change as it develops. So if you look at how a chimpanzee skull develops, it starts off very round with a small face, right? And then as it grows, the face bones get really big relative to the size of the brain case. So the brain case gets smaller, the jaws and teeth get huge, relatively speaking. The face is really big, relatively speaking. Whereas if you look at how the skull changes in a human, it's much less drastic change, right? So anthropologists, people who study human evolution, right, look at this and say, oh, well, this is a pedomorphic trait. Adult humans have skulls much more similar to fetal skulls than in other primates. What's the benefit of having a skull like this? I'm gonna take a sip of water and let you think about that. God, that's so gross. I'm sorry. Mute that when I do that. Why? What's the benefit there? What's the benefit of having a skull shaped like this instead of shaped like that? Well, maybe let's talk about one thing that's not a benefit, right? Chimpanzees, because their jaws are so huge, chimpanzees have way stronger bite strength than we do. They are mean if they want to be, right? They can crush bones with those jaws, right? Which is a good reason why chimpanzees don't make good pets. There was, you guys, most of you are probably too young for this, but I want to say I was in college, maybe high school, and there was a story about a couple that had a chimpanzee as a pet, and one day the chimp was like, and I'm done with you guys, and he straight bit off the guy's genitals. He just like, just bit the whole thing off. Yeah, chimps they look cute when you dress them up, but they are wild animals, okay? Right, so we don't have as strong a jaws as that, but there must be some sort of advantage. Otherwise, why have the round heads that we have if there's no advantage? All right, well, look at the size of the brain case, the area where the brain is found. It's a lot bigger, right? So for us, that's our main weapon, is our brain, right? We don't have particularly sharp teeth. We don't have talons. We don't make venom, right? Our brain is our weapon because we use it to make spears, guns, and stuff. Yeah? Anyway, so pedomorphosis, another example. Okay. Last thing about macroevolution is the speed of evolution, the tempo, if you will. There's sort of two models that describe evolution. One is the gradual model, where you can see lots of changes kind of slowly over time, right? And two species gradually become different. And then the punctuated model, or what is also called punctuated equilibrium, is where in a relatively short period of time, a lot of change occurs, and then populations are like steady after that. Okay. Combination of both of these things happen, but it turns out that this happens a lot, punctuated equilibrium. And one thing I want to remind you is that when we talk about time in an evolutionary context, we're talking about like geologic time scale, right? So fast in this case means 1,000 years, not 15 minutes. Okay, just so you know. Okay, so we see both of these, but we see this a lot. We see punctuated equilibrium a lot, right? And then this is another graph that kind of helps you appreciate that, right? So gradual change, slow over time, and then punctuated equilibrium, evolution by jerks. So it looks like you go same, all of a sudden different, when in reality, there is a gradual change, but it's faster, super fast at those points. Okay? Okay. I'm not gonna talk about that because I'm tired. Okay. So the last video I'll do in the morning, but by the time you see it, you'll just click on to the next one. Okay? Stop in here. All right. I'm gonna go sleep now. I'm high on Benadryl.